Okay, it's March 7th, 2022 at 8:25 a.m. and I'm going to try to put together the rubric that's in my mind and the time period that's allotted to me to try to get this message to you guys in a coherent way. Not quite sure I'll be able to do it, but here it goes. Look, I woke up this morning with, again, a barrage like I do every single morning of information, but this is now starting to crystallize in my mind. So let's start with what's happening with Putin and the invasion of Ukraine, and ultimately, why would a guy who's a grandmaster at chess, former director of the KGB, who's looking strategically to potentially recreate kind of a version of what might be a fusion of the Romanov Empire and what was once the power of the Soviet Union, but in a slightly different form, because Putin is definitely not Stalin, and Putin's more like, the ultimate oligarch, right? I mean, he's the king of Russia is what he is. But ultimately, when you have to compartmentalize an understanding that really Russia is mostly a fossil fuel petrol state, and that's really the most value that it has. I think the GDP of Russia is actually smaller than the state of Texas. Now, granted, Texas is a big GDP and a powerhouse, but ultimately, how would it be possible for Russia to create a global contagion that could ultimately, destroy the world financial apparatus? And to what end? And why would that be part and parcel to what it is that maybe Putin is doing? Now, all of this is just speculation on my part. I have no evidence. I'm just basically reading the tea leaves based on what I'm actually an expert in, which is control fraud and international international money laundering and all of the different things that basically constitute what our financial sector has become, driven by what we call the shadow sector. So ultimately, Wall Street right now, as it turns out, is on the hook for $41 billion in credit default swaps and a variety of other derivatives based on Russian debt. We're seeing all sorts of downstream effects, like, for example, Credit Suisse is liquidating all sorts of Russian oligarchs, yachts and planes and other real estate and all of that kind of stuff, because they were all, lending on the margins because of the precarious scenario of which oligarchs extract big time money from the fossil fuel state and then launder it throughout the Western Europe, particularly through the city of London, New York, and Los Angeles, particularly in Hollywood. And that comes back to former Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin under Trump, who also is a big Hollywood executive producer. I'm certainly not helping my Hollywood aims by pointing this out, but the bottom line, I have no interest in working with Steve Mnuchin, okay? The bottom line is Mnuchin came from Goldman Sachs, then Treasury, and he's basically created the situation to foster the international laundering because it was helping out his former boss, President Trump, then President Trump, because his entire real estate machine was predicated on Saudis and Russians and UAE and all of these other guys, extracting wealth and then putting it in Western markets. So going back to the initial question, given what took place in 2008, we had a run in all of the markets that destroyed global liquidity, where ultimately the Federal Reserve had to step in and inject trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars to backstop a giant criminal apparatus, which is on display at www.thecon.tv. If you wrap your head around that, then you understand what I'm talking about, and this doesn't sound like Chinese, because you've got to understand the methodology of the fraud, the control fraud that undergirds what started with predation, targeting the most vulnerable amongst us to create all of these fees for all of the middlemen involved with this absolute fraud pipeline that goes all the way up to guys like Warren Buffett, and then ultimately collapse the world in the Treasury, not the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, put in trillions of dollars that nobody understands about. That created the situation that we're in the midst of. So, for example, if there's a run and all of the banks step back because nobody knows who's holding the other derivatives and nobody starts lending, we're right back in the same situation of 2008, which could create contagion, which would then, if you understand the SWIFT international banking apparatus that's run out of Amsterdam, which the United States and the West and the UK have incredible influence over, that they've seized these assets, that they've supposedly through these these markers of being able to choke the Russian economy. Ultimately, these sanctions is what I'm trying to say. And Russia said, Putin said, that's a declaration of war. Okay, that's a little bit problematic when Russia has probably the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. I'm not sure exactly where we are after everything that took place in the kind of the downturn after the Cold War, but they've got plenty to make life very miserable for a lot of people, especially if it creates this global contagion. Now, all of this stuff, in my mind, goes immediately to crypto. Okay, so for like the last 8 years, I've been trying to figure out why crypto was such a big deal. And ultimately, I kept asking the question to all of my friends who've been investing in crypto for a long time. Okay, let's see what happens during the next global contagion. Is crypto going to be there to save the world like fiat currency was during 2009 and then in 2019? And in my mind, as I was trying to, weave my way through it, I could never understand how crypto and blockchain and all of those different situations could in any way, offer an alternative to, the power of the dollar. Now let's look back at motivation. If you're Vladimir Putin and you're like this grand chess, multi-dimensional strategist, and everything that his entire career has been all about, given the history of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which actually started in 1998 because there was a derivatives run through long-term capital managements, was all of these, quants that got together and did all of this crazy leverage that ultimately tanked the freaking ruble. And I've always speculated that Putin was playing the long game to get revenge. So is it possible that Putin would want to collapse the dollar, is the American dollar is the reserve currency? Well, if you look at China, China is really the key swing player here. It's not Saudi Arabia anymore. But let's point out really quick in terms of humanitarian crisis, I think Saudi is bombing the living hell out of Yemen today. Oh my God, really? So what's that all about? I mean, they've been doing it nonstop and starving the Yemenis, and we've been supporting them. And of course, Trump was selling all of the arms, and then Biden continued because it's Saudi freaking Arabia who created 9/11 and the world that we've been living in afterwards. But here we are with this like crazy post, communistic situation and everything that comes from it. And then ultimately, so the question is it possible that Putin had this notion with China, because China is circling Taiwan, to create somewhat of a new global currency stemming from potentially blockchain and crypto? And that brings me back, and I got to just finish with this thought. We got celebrities like Matt Damon, a guy who was actually the narrator of Inside Job, who should know a lot of what I'm talking about, if not more. And then we saw crypto become the namesake of, the Staples Arena, and I think where the Miami Heat play. It's this international thing, right? And yet, so the bold idea that, somebody like Matt Damon is talking about, shame on you, Matt Damon, if you didn't know what I'm talking about or can even understand the inferences, because it's like, wait a second, is crypto being used to collapse the American dollar? Like we don't need any help ourselves because of all the corruption that takes place within Wall Street and everything that constitutes. And so here we are at this crossroads, right? Where, we're dealing with so many insane problems, but I think it's potentially an end of an era. What I've been trying to lay on you people is this is 4 or 5 decades in the making. It just gets worse and worse and worse, and the whole thing is designed to fail for the short term for the people manipulating and puppeteering the whole thing. And they've gone against the interests of what the United States is supposed to stand for. So our principles are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're supposed to live in a country where, the integrity of law maintains that nobody is above the law. All of those things went out the window a long time ago. It's corruption. It's insane corruption. But here's the thing. They blew us up in 2008. That was after 4 decades of getting rid of the golden goose and this globalism that ultimately that they could play middlemen and hedge. There is no allegiance by Wall Street and these moneymakers and everything else to any principles or sanctity of all of the lessons that we learned, not to mention the 246-year history of the United States, and then ultimately, what we learned, in the modern era. From World War I, specifically the sacrifices of World War II, that gave us the ability to have, the leverage of why the world was trading in dollars. It's because we won World War II. We had the most resources. At the time before we went into fiat currency, we had the world's gold. And ultimately, we were able to parlay that because we had the world's strongest economy. And I think, we still have the world's strongest economy. Our economy is multitudes larger than Russia. But here is Putin in a very strange predicament, basically leveraging what he can leverage based on everything I just said. And what's the outcome? He's all in. And so if the Russian ruble has no value, if we tank the Russian markets, and he doesn't have, 6 steps sideways and around to maneuver that could actually lead to creating a global run on the American dollars, I think we're doing it to ourselves right now. Now, again, this is all speculation. I have no idea if this is what's going on. Only time will tell. But knowing what I know, and this is why you have to understand what the con is. Because our financial system has complete control of our government, because they have complete control of our central bank, and they're fueling criminal enterprises. Most notably, what Russia's involved with in this particular instance. The whole freaking world's in on it. Saudi Arabia and everything else. And I'll finish with this thought, okay? Try to put yourself in this situation. Imagine, if you will, suddenly every newspaper and every mainstream media and everybody started telling you what it is that I'm telling you. What they would start telling you is Saudi Arabia and major players within our government knew that Al-Qaeda was going to strike and allowed them to do it because we wanted to continue our dependence on fossil fuel, which runs 75% of the global economy, that ultimately Wall Street can hedge and bet derivatives and futures on, because ultimately the dollar, a huge part of it, depends on whether or not Saudi, the swing producer, is trading in American dollars, which gives us the ability to be able to be the world's the world's currency, right? Everybody trades in dollars. So all of that being equal, that allowed our financial system, with this just ruthless insanity, to basically destroy the American middle class and, quite frankly, the American dream. And they got away with it because nobody stopped them. Because our Department of Justice and our FBI and our SEC and all of the AGs around the country got ultimately, I think, surprised, attacked, nuked, and they didn't have the resources and the ability to fight back. That's what's on display in the con. Ultimately, what we prove is that they were able to maneuver around existing laws to create situations to overwhelm the system that ultimately was illegal the whole time. They didn't, like Obama, because he's an attorney and he's this Harvard grad and, he's super, like all of these guys. They can operate, on 15 different levels in the law, unfortunately. And I'll go back to what, Bastiat said. When a group of men discover plunder, they create a legal code to authorize it and a moral code to glorify it. All of this stuff is smoke and mirrors for the power. So look, right now we're faced with a situation where you've got, really in the American elections, and we're about to approach the midterms, you've got the Wall Street meritocracy, which is 4 decades of, Ivy League neoliberal policy and financialization that led to globalism, that led to this frickin' racket, okay? That's one side, which the right deems as the deep state, and they're not wrong, because it involves military-industrial complex, Wall Street, fossil fuel, and, of course, agriculture and all the big five that basically come from that in terms of the tiers of our economy. And then ultimately, the other choice is white supremacy. Okay, so who am I? I'm a guy who believes in liberty and justice for all and the dynamism of upward mobility based on supply and demand and aligned interest. And ultimately, if you fail, you fail. That means you can come back from failure, but you fail. That doesn't mean you allow the corrupt system to control everything for their benefit, because it's an inside game of which everybody else is basically, chattel for, being led to slaughter. I'm not freaking expendable. Chances are you're not either. I'm trying to reach the 1 out of 10 of you out there that's educated enough to know that you're getting played and wants to do something about it. We've got to create an alternative movement to be able to create the resurrection. So again, in conclusion, hashtag Patrick Lovell, Truth Bombs the Con. Go like and subscribe me on YouTube, because we've got nearly 400,000 views and 20,000 likes and all sorts of action happening on TikTok. I need to translate that over just in case somehow my voice ends. And ultimately, we need that on YouTube. I'm trying to pressure Jon Stewart to get information out there if I can connect with them, but his gatekeepers are closing us out because they're so smart. That's really what it comes down to. I'm trying to get to Russell Brand and Joe Rogan. Kind of the same thing, a little bit different variables. They're all good guys. They're all trying to get to the solution. Same with Yanis Varoufakis, who I just heard on Russell Brand. But the bottom line, the net, as I like to say, is it's all corruption. And nobody understands control fraud. Nobody understands policy. Nobody understands the geopolitics of 4 or 5 decades, except for the people that are manipulating it all. And unfortunately, for some reason, I'm the only one willing to go the distance to try to reveal that to the common person, so that we can collectively come together to basically purge corruption. Not basically. We've got to save ourselves from ourselves. And I believe in liberty and justice for all. I believe in the integrity of law, and I'm willing to go the distance for it. Are you? That's the question. Onwards and upwards.